Hey, welcome to Crossroads. Folks, I want to start off with a big update. I want to restructure Crossroads, and I know I've done this quite a few times, but hear me out. I feel that, frankly, I'm not doing what I would like to do for this show. I want to get back into investigative journalism. I want to do things that are deeper and more valuable. To be honest, I feel the show has become a bit too much focused on frankly, just normal news conflicts. And it's lost some of the depth that I would like the show to have. And so I'm going to be working now on more investigations, more in-depth coverage, less commentary, I'd say, and more explaining issues and why they really matter, and also looking for bigger stories that maybe you haven't heard of. I want to bring Crossroads back to its roots, and so I'm glad to have you all here with me. That being said, I'm going to be doing it a bit differently. We're restructuring a few things. For now, at least, I'm not saying we'll bring it back in the future, but for now, we're not going to do it live. One of the reasons for this is because I'm going to be doing a lot more research and maybe a lot more interviews on the side and so on. And because of that, just my time's going to be a bit different. I love talking to y'all. I really enjoy it. I do love our conversations again. But at least for this interim stage, I kind of need the time to focus on this. That being said, of course, we're still going to have the normal news, or the normal setup for the show. We're still going to do it at the normal time. So nothing's technically changing. Don't worry. Don't go anywhere. Don't panic. We'll still be doing the show at the normal times, 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. And so nothing's changing on that. But I think you'll enjoy it. I'm going to be starting to do just more research, more depth, and what I hope will be a lot better content. I want to improve the quality of the show. And so that said, folks, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for sticking with us. Let's jump into the first part of this now. I want to talk first on what's happening with all this discussion around nuclear war, because you may have been seeing a lot of headlines, very scary sounding ones. There's talk, for example, of Russia threatening to use nukes against Ukraine. There's talks, for example, of Iran developing or coming very close to developing nuclear weapons. The United States is even talking about renewing some of its nuclear programs. And for anybody who was alive in the 80s, and I grew up when the Cold War ended. I was a young kid still. I have very vague memories of it, but I do remember the fear of nuclear war. It was a very real concern. The fear I think we're going into now is the question of are we entering that state again? Are we re-entering that state where nuclear war could become a reality? And are these irrational fears? Is what we're watching in the world actually on that level? Well, I want to discuss that with you today. Now, first off, the United States, they are now considering expanding their nuclear arsenal, and this is actually real. What's happening with this is the New START treaty between the United States and Russia. That was Obama administration. The New START treaty was when they had a new start to diplomacy with Russia. And part of that agreement was to reduce and maybe one day get rid of nuclear weapons. The U.S. was on board, Russia was on board. The problem is that, well, it's ending very soon. In fact, in 2026, the New START treaty comes to an end. And it does not appear that it's going to be renewed. The hope that we could live in a world without nuclear weapons because of this is quickly becoming a thing of the past. But even with the New START treaty coming to an end, even aside from that, because again, that's the U.S. and Russia, right? Other countries are now actively developing nuclear weapons and even creating new types of nuclear weapons. Systems, for example, that bypass the systems in place to intercept or detect nuclear weapon attacks. And because of this, the threats of them using them are becoming actually a lot more common. Russia, for example, they're planning to hold military exercises as well in the Caribbean with Cuba. And this is also bringing back some memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Chinese Communist Party has now declared that nuclear weapons are part of its defensive strategy against the United States. So look, what's really going on? How did we get to this point? And, basically, is there any credibility to these threats that are now being made? Well, let's start what's being said on the U.S. side. Now, last Friday, Pranay Vadi, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for the Arms Control of the White House, he spoke at the Arms Control Association, and he said that absent a change in nuclear strategy by U.S. adversaries like China and Russia, the U.S. may need to expand its nuclear arsenal. Watch.
Russia, the PRC, and North Korea are all expanding and diversifying their nuclear arsenals at a breakneck pace, showing little or no interest in arms control. Those three, together with Iran, are increasingly cooperating and coordinating with each other in ways that run counter to peace and stability, threaten the United States, our allies and our partners, and exacerbate regional tensions. They are also freely proliferating advanced missile and drone technology among one another and around the globe. Absent a change in the trajectory of adversary arsenals, we may reach a point in the coming years where an increase from current deployed numbers is required. And we need to be fully prepared to execute if the President makes that decision, if he makes that decision. If that day does come, it will result from a determination that more nuclear weapons are required to deter our adversaries and protect the American people and our allies and partners.
Now, why is this speech important? Well, according to the New York Times, it confirms what officials have been saying for more than a year. They said this, that Mr. Vadi confirmed what officials have been saying in private conversations and closed congressional testimony again for more than a year. They say it is the inevitable outgrowth, they have argued, of China's rapid nuclear expansion and Russia's repeated threats to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They note that China is on a path to match the number of American and Russian deployed nuclear weapons by 2035, according to the Pentagon's public estimates. They note that Mr. Putin has fixated on unusual weapons, including an undersea nuclear torpedo that could be launched across the Pacific to destroy the west coast of the United States. And the United States has warned that in recent months that Russia has a program underway to put a nuclear bomb into orbit. In other words, other countries are actively expanding their nuclear programs, but they're also, again, developing new types of nuclear weapons. If any of you were alive during the Cold War, you might remember the talk of Star Wars, and I don't mean the movie, I mean the military program. There were discussions of putting nuclear weapons in space, and that is important because, well, if you put them into orbit and you can launch them from orbit, you can't intercept them using conventional interceptors. It's a way to basically change the rules of the game. Same thing with undersea nuclear torpedoes. If you have those, of course, conventional systems to intercept nuclear weapons might not work anymore. And so these are things that change the game. These are systems that change the rules on what was, again, the whole idea of nuclear deterrence. The idea that other countries have them, yes, but again, if you use them, there's mutual destruction, and so people don't use them because there's a risk in doing so. Again, remember, folks, part of the nature of nuclear weapons is that they're deterrence. The hope is that we never have to use them. I think most countries hope they never have to use them. They are tools for mutually assured destruction. If one country could destroy another without risk, well, there is less of a guarantee of them not using them. In other words, if a foreign adversary were to, for example, have the ability to use a nuclear weapon to eliminate the threats to their agendas, well, there is a chance they could use them still. The reason they don't is because the threat against them in return, the retaliation, is too high. And so this kind of game is played where other countries just maintain this tension but don't go beyond that. That is what is now at risk. Now, the United States has so far kept to its commitment to phase out nuclear weapons. Again, the U.S. has been trying to get rid of them, at the very least. And at the very least, again, they're not expanding the programs. They have been improving their nuclear weapons, but again, they're not growing them, we're not developing new types, we're not advancing the technology so much. And changing this, which they're not discussing doing, expanding the number of nuclear weapons, again, maybe even developing newer and even more effective nuclear weapon systems or things that change the game, space-based nuclear weapons and otherwise. That would be a significant change in policy for the United States. Now look, back to the statements that the United States may again expand its nuclear programs. Let me show you a bit more on that from Newsweek. They say that Vadi's comments come against the backdrop of growing tensions between the U.S. and both Russia and China, sparking fears of an all-out war. In May, they note, Russia conducted tactical nuclear weapons drills in response, they said, to provocative statements and threats by individual Western officials. They note that hosts and guests on Russian state TV have repeatedly threatened nuclear strikes on Western powers, including the US, France, the UK, and the Netherlands. And remember, the context of that is that all these other countries have talked about the possibility of joining the war alongside Ukraine against Russia. And Russia, seeing that as a threat to them, which it would be, frankly, are using nuclear threats as a deterrent to that possibility, suggesting again that mutually assured destruction is in place, that if the free world wants to come against Russia and that would ensure Russia's possible destruction, that Russia would use these weapons that assure mutual destruction if that line is crossed. But the big thing again is that they're using nuclear threats, and the threat of that is again bringing the world back into this Cold War era where nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons are again on the table. It notes at the time that on Wednesday, Russia's President Vladimir Putin warned he could deploy conventional missiles within range of Western powers after a number of these gave Ukraine permission to hit Russian military targets on its own soil with their weapons for the first time. Something that has been cleared, by the way, now. Now, it seems possible the United States is expanding its nuclear program, so this is not just empty talk. But I'll be talking about all this more after a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges with a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold. You can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. A new nuclear arms race is brewing as treaties against nuclear weapons are beginning to falter and as global conflicts are beginning to stir again. For the first time in decades, the United States is considering expanding its nuclear arsenal rather than reducing the number of weapons, which for a good while has been the policy. Now, this isn't just empty talk either. This is Semaphore. Here's what they had to say. They say the U.S. believes it needs to adopt a more competitive approach to non-proliferation, the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and also of arms control. In light, they say, of rising global tensions and to, quote, make certain adjustments to our posture and capabilities. And they cite those comments to a senior administration official. It says that the administration, the White House, they still have hopes, they say, to bring its geopolitical rivals to the negotiating table, but wants to show there will be consequences for rebuffing talks, the official added. They note that Russia and China, quote, will face a diminished security environment if they continue to refuse to engage. And they note that while they offered relatively few specifics about the future policy changes, this official with the White House told Semaphore that the administration's increasingly forceful thinking was reflected in decisions to develop a new nuclear gravity bomb and efforts to extend the life of some Ohio-class nuclear submarines. Those are, of course, the doomsday subs that the United States have. And the idea of a nuclear gravity bomb would be kind of a next-gen U.S.-built nuclear weapon, meaning again that we may be joining the arms race yet again. Now, they note the administration is also considering how its nuclear forces may have to evolve further when facing rising nuclear threats, because again, they're talking about space war, they're talking about space-based nuclear weapons, they're talking about nuclear torpedoes and things we have not yet had to deal with, which require, of course, new forms of nuclear deterrence if we believe those weapons are being fielded. It notes as well that they're working to ensure that key allies as well have long-range strike capabilities and surveillance abilities needed to defend themselves, the official said. And that has deeper implications as well, because remember that the United States is essentially the leader of the free world, and as part of that leadership, we also help defend many countries in the free world. And that includes, if unfortunately nuclear weapons are a threat, the deployment of systems to detect and intercept nuclear weapons for U.S. allies. Something that has been happening, for example, in parts of Europe, something that's been happening in parts of Asia, including previously in South Korea. It was very controversial with the Chinese Communist Party and other countries, meaning that we may be re-entering that type of very delicate ground, something very controversial and something that goes very strongly in the line of risking, I would say, at the very least, threats of war. Now, they note as well the White House is also starting to lay the groundwork for the key nuclear issues Biden would face if he is reelected. They note that while the U.S. and Russia remain bound legally by the New START Treaty, again, the Obama-era one, the last agreement limiting the world's two largest nuclear arsenals, that is set to expire in 2026. And that means whoever comes into office next, we'll see who it is, will have to face the ending of the New START Treaty and have to figure out what America's position is going to be going forward with nuclear weapons. Now, this is all happening in the backdrop that Russia is preparing for military exercises alongside Cuba and the Caribbean, and what appears to really just be a show of force on America's doorstep. American Military News said that with these things, Russia is preparing to deploy aircraft and combat naval vessels to the Caribbean to conduct military exercises in the coming weeks. Its first exercises in the Western Hemisphere involve both air and sea activity in 5 years, a senior administration official told McClathy and the Miami Herald. And notes that the Biden administration is not expressing concern over the development, with the official stating it poses, quote, no direct threat to the United States. But the administration believes Moscow intends to use the exercises as a messaging tactic. After President Joe Biden gave Ukraine permission last week to fire U.S.-made weapons across its border into Russia to defend its territory. And remember, given the fact that the U.S. is now allowing Ukraine to strike some targets within Russia, although not able to target the Kremlin, not able to target Moscow, that Russia was countering that with nuclear threats. And as part of that nuclear threat, they've again done something that looks a whole lot like the Cuban Missile Crisis. They note that Russia has sailed ships into the Western Hemisphere every year from 2013 to 2020 and has sent flights through the regions that violated the airspace of U.S. allies. But the anticipated activity, this big upcoming exercise, would be the first coordinated air and sea exercise of its kind since 2019 during the Trump administration, according to this official. So, in other words, the military exercise, it's not technically out of the norm. It's being pumped up a bit too much by the media in some regards, right? Russia did the same thing or something very similar when Trump was in office. This is not necessarily unusual, but it does send a message, and that's the important part with this. The United States and other countries, they also tend to hold exercises like this sometimes. There are a lot of different reasons they do this. One, for example, is a show of force. You want to demonstrate to another country that military, the use of force is on the table if they overstep certain boundaries. And you move your military into their territorial waters or nearby, and you hold a big exercise as a show of force. Another is to carry out surveillance using onboard systems. For example, if other ships are nearby, if, for example, they go near sensitive outlets or something like that, they can detect certain signals, and there's a type of surveillance that is carried out oftentimes. And another is to move troops and forces to a region without saying you're going to do it for hostile reasons. And that's, of course, one of the bigger concerns that people often have with these types of exercises. That if you were to, for example, launch a war against another country, you would need to move your military assets to a certain region to prepare for that. And the moving of those without first saying why you're doing it, if you were saying that you're doing it for hostile intent or not giving a reason, the country might believe you're planning to invade them. But if you just say, hey, we're going to hold military exercises close to you, then that gives an alibi for moving those forces. And so again, That is one of the concerns that comes about with this, that it does look like a military preparedness exercise. Again, putting assets in place for potential invasion, which is, again, part of the show of force and part of the threat that comes about from things like this. Take, for example, the Chinese Communist Party and the concerns that it could surround Taiwan with its military. What do? Well, they don't attack Taiwan. They don't actually cut it off. But they do move their military assets and encircle Taiwan and then call it a military exercise. But also there's just the tit-for-tat reasons. One country does it, another's region, so they do it right back. And oftentimes that's done to say that, hey, you're threatening us, we'll threaten you right back, don't cross the line. But the current operation with Russia and Cuba, it does have some additional significance because, again, this comes in the midst of a lot of nuclear threats. This comes, again, in the context that the U.S. has now given Ukraine to strike some targets in Russia, and Russia making nuclear threats in retaliation on that. And this, again, paired with Russian operations alongside Cuba, well, that brings back memories of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia was, again, moving military assets to that same region, and again, working with Cuba, and concerns that they were going to start placing nuclear weapons in Cuba, which again presents a very real nuclear threat to the United States. The image, in other words, the optics of this are reminiscent of that time, and they carry that same implication. And again, remember, this is happening as these global tensions are rising. Some of the surface threats over nukes have been pretty loud as well. But I'll be talking about all this a lot more exclusively on EpochTV.com. It's our uncensored streaming platform. So if you're not watching us on EpochTV.com, this is your chance to come and join us for honest and truthful reporting. There's a link in the description below that you can click on to get access to the rest of this episode, as well as many other great reports, shows, premium articles that we have at the Epoch Times. Before we go exclusively to EpochTV.com, though, let me show you a trailer of my documentary, The Final War, which exposes one of the biggest threats to America, the Chinese Communist Party's 100-year plan to defeat the United States. In that documentary, I expose how and why the Chinese regime is trying to infiltrate and subvert the United States. If you'd like to watch that documentary, you can find it in a link in the description below, and I will see you on Epoch TV for the rest of this episode.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China.
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.